but just the ones that have an ID of data. Now we know that this is unique, so we're only going to get one record back, right? Are we guaranteed to get one record back?
No.
What might come back?
404.
404, that's careful, that is an HTTP term, but it applies here in just a minute. We're going to get nothing back. Now, from the client's perspective, what status code would that be? 404. From the database perspective, I just don't need to get terminology confused. So we're going to translate an empty database query into a 404. That's important, and that's part of your assignment. But at this point, we're going to get back nothing. But actually, we haven't gotten anything because we haven't even asked for the data, so we got to do that. So if we ask for the data, it's going to look like this. Okay, so that's saying fetch all. It doesn't quite make sense, but let's go with it for a minute. Fetch all returns what?
Everything that the cursor currently is.
Yeah, everything that the cursor found, so it kind of assumes a query. So we gave it a query, and then specifically a select query. It wouldn't make sense to fetch after an insert. That doesn't work. But a select will allow you to fetch. So what happens if we get our restaurant with ID 5 or whatever? What are we going to get here? What data type? There's way more than a string. More specific. More specific. Be very specific. What are we going to get? What data structure? A list with a dictionary inside of it, right? Remember? Fetch all is going to give us a list, and we're going to have that dictionary inside of that list. Okay, so the correct answer, if you were being very terse, would be a list. That's what you would have said. I would have at least given you partial credit for that. You're going to get a list back. It's just going to have one dictionary. Now, okay, question. What happens if I put ID number 5 million and I don't have that one? Now what am I going to get?
An empty list.
What's an empty dictionary?
An empty list with no dictionaries. No dictionaries, no records, but we do get a list and it's empty. So that would happen, and that's actually okay. I mean, that would work, right? I can return that and be okay. Conceptually, it doesn't make sense. Why? Why does a list not make sense? Because we're only asking for one item. We're not actually asking for one item, but we're expecting at most one item because we know the constraint on the data being is unique. So if we're only ever expecting one thing back, why are we asking for a list? Well, because that's all we know how to do. But there's another way, right? There's another way. You can ask for just a single item if you're only expecting a single item. So it's important for you to know, number one, fetch all always returns a list. But don't ask for a list if you're only wanting one thing anyway. That's silly. Why do you need a list for one thing? That doesn't make sense. So it would be nice if we could just get that one object, in this case a dictionary. So fetch one is your friend in this case. Fetch one. You're saying, hey, I'm looking for data, but just, one thing. That's all I want, just the one. So if this returns a restaurant, what is fetch one going to return?
Just the
A dictionary, a single dictionary. If we put in 5 million and we don't get a result back, nothing was found, what are we going to get now? None. We will get the none type, right? Even a dictionary that's empty implies a record, but if we're not going to get any records, the equivalent of an empty list in singular form is just none, right? The none type, just none. It's important for you to know that fetch one returns none if there's no result, right? So let's see, fetch one either returns none or it returns a dictionary, and fetch all either returns an empty array or it returns potentially many things, or just one, if there really was just one, right? Maybe I'm asking for all of the restaurants, but I only have one, period, so I'm going to get an array with one thing. That makes sense, because tomorrow maybe I'll have another one, okay? So think about the data. You got to be really analytical with the data. If you don't, well, it's going to be really hard for you to really wrap your head around what's going on in the big picture if you don't understand the details. Also, it's going to be really hard for you to understand the details if you don't understand the big picture. So you've got to keep both in mind. Why are we here? Specifically, we're trying to load a restaurant. Why? Because the server is calling this method. Why? Because the client asked the server for a single restaurant. Why? I don't know. Maybe the user clicked a button that asked for that restaurant. Done. Okay. I want to stop right now and say that this functionality may not be used by your client app. This may not be necessary. The only reason we're doing it is so that you get a preview of how to do something like delete, which is going to be required. You're going to have to delete stuff. Same thing with update. It gives you an idea on how to do like where. So it's like a sneak peek. You might use this. I'm not saying you won't. I'm just saying it's not required. On the assignment description, it's literally listed as optional. You might use this. You might not. But I want it on your server. I will check to see if it's on your server. Just for completeness sake, I just don't want you to necessarily look to the client. You might not need this. And the reason for that is you're already getting the data this way. So you have flexibility in how you do this. This might be good enough. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's keep going. I think this is good. Okay, so I'm given a restaurant ID. I put it into an array just for the sake of passing it to this. Okay, so this must be an array. Query looks good. Don't forget to return. A lot of you guys are forgetting the return step, at least on these two. You don't need that here, but you do here, okay, because you're giving data back to the server. Whoever calls this needs the data response, or there's no point in doing it. Okay, so I'm going to move this over and come back to where we were on the server and figure out how to plug all this in. Okay, just hide that for a minute. All right, so let's do this. Self.send response, it's still a 200. Self. I'm just going to copy all these headers. They're literally all the same. So, okay, and then I'm going to get my database again. And I'm going to ask the database to give me one restaurant, and I'm going to pass it what? The identifier up top. The one I've established isn't none, okay? You can take this further. You can make sure it's an integer if you want. This is probably the bare minimum, just to make sure it's provided. But yeah, it should be an ID. Remember, it will be a string, but it should be an ID, an integer inside of that string. And so it's okay, you don't have to convert it as an int or anything unless you want to make sure, but pass that off down here, and that'll be plugged in as the restaurant ID, which will then go to the database and you'll get something back. So get one restaurant, the identifier. The reason I called it just identifier is because up here it could be an identifier for any resource. So it's a little more generic in this context. Okay, and if you're going to get one restaurant, then you probably should make that JSON like this. And if you're going to make it JSON, you should probably make it bytes so you can send it off to the server. And if you're going to get bytes, you might as well send it to the client. Okay. So it's a really long line, and you can break that up if you want to, but don't forget what you're doing. You're getting the data, you're making it JSON specifically, right? Because you're sending all data to the client as JSON data. You're wrapping it as bytes because that's what's required to send off to the HTTP. Okay, it gets a little crazy, yes? You good with that though? Okay. Notice the only difference between these two is just this part. All right, what data you're sending back and using the identifier since you've got it. Here there's no identifier, nothing else. Okay, and I mentioned that this code needs to be cleaned up. We'll do that, it's getting way out of hand already. But in a nutshell, my whole screen now, all of a sudden, is doGet, right? doGet is filling my whole screen, right? It's printing the path, it's splitting up the path into its pieces, so we know what the heck we're supposed to do. And then if I have the restaurants resource, but nothing after that, then I get all the restaurants. If I've got the restaurants resource and an identifier specifically, I fetch that one and send it back. And if it's anything else, I don't really deal with anything that isn't restaurants, so I'm just giving a 404 back. Yep.
So, do we have to, like, catch what comes back and say,
Yes.
hey, if this is none, return 404?
Yes, thank you. Good catch, because that's what we're going to do right now. Do you guys see that? Someone said 404 a minute ago, and I said, well, the database doesn't give a 404 response. It gives back none. But we should, on the server, we should say, oh, wait a minute, hold the phone. Let's not jump to conclusions, which we just did. Let's not jump to conclusions. What if this is null? None, right? What if, not the identifier, but the restaurant we get back, if it's not found, that means the client provided an identifier. It was not none, it was something, but that something wasn't a match. Like they asked for restaurant number 25 and we've only got 18 restaurants. Fail. So at this point, this is going to return none, and it would work. It would return none. It'll return like null, basically, because none gets converted to null, and it wouldn't crash. It would actually work fine. But you're kind of lying. You're saying 200 okay, here's nothing. It's kind of rude. So the server should say, well, actually, wait, I get what you're asking for. Totally understand. I see what you want, but I don't actually have that restaurant. I'm going to tell you straight up right now, that's not happening. That's a 404. So you're going to have to get a little fancier. Up here, if there weren't any restaurants, what does this return?
Empty list.
Yeah, remember we went over this? An empty list. Is it appropriate to return a 200 in that case?
Yeah, you got something.
The client says, hello, I would like all of your restaurants. And you say, oh yes, I know about restaurants, here are all of them. That's not a lie, but this is. Okay, some of you could argue, well, I still think a 404 would be appropriate even still. That's okay, you could do that if you want, but that wouldn't be so common. Typically the 404 is if you're being very, asked a very specific question and you don't have that specific thing, 404. Here you're just like, yeah, sure, here's an empty list. And then the client knows, absolutely, cool, we've got no data, that's fine, at least I know now, here's the collection, it's empty, okay? So it's semantically a little bit different, I think, okay? And if you're thinking I'm splitting hairs, yeah, kind of, this world is very specific sometimes, right? So let's pull this out into a variable so that we can check to see if it's none, and then behave accordingly. Let me show you what that looks like, okay? It looks like this. So still need the database, and I'm going to get the restaurant, just like we did. What am I doing it here for? It needs to be more like right here. Get one restaurant. Okay. So do that first, because then you can say, well, okay, if restaurant, then excellent. I don't want to do this again though, I'm just going to use my variable. But if I don't have a restaurant, that must mean it's none, right? So what do we do?
Set 404 flags.
Yeah, 404. Here's the problem. If I start sending a 404 right now, let's move forward a little bit. So let's just do the beginning. Send response 404, etc., etc. What have I done wrong now?
You've already sent a response.
I've already sent a 200. So if the client is like, hey, can I have a restaurant? And you're like, yeah, 200, 404. What is going to happen? You're going to get a malformed response. Can a response have two status codes? No, that doesn't make any sense. So be careful when you start doing if and else that you're going to start moving this in a little bit. Okay, so don't send two responses. That's really, really, really bad. And you'll be scratching your head wondering why everything's broken. Yeah, that would be why. So just be really careful here that before you actually respond, you know what you're responding as. And then down here, I can just really ugly copy and paste this here. See how that works? Okay, so now I've established it. very first step here this time is, okay, you know what, I don't even know how to respond, I've got to talk to the database first. Otherwise, how would you know? Then go get the data, and then based on the data that came back, decide how you're going to respond. And I like to put my responses in their entirety together. And I'll do one better. We're going to clean up all this code. It doesn't even fit on the screen anymore. I've now grown way outside of that. Okay, so if that's your measure of too much code, that failed. And even independent of that, this is way too much code all lumped together. Does this make sense though? Okay. Notice all these nested if, else, elif, it's getting nuts. It's getting way too crazy. But this code should work. I want to test it before I keep going, get too fancy. You know, make it complicated first, test it, then simplify and test again, right? Don't do too much without testing it. Because we haven't even made sure this works, right? We haven't tested much yet. Okay, so run my server. Hit up Postman. Let's just make sure restaurants work, because I even changed that. I need to test everything pretty much. Only thing I didn't change was post. Probably should test that too though. Okay, so here's restaurants. Not bad. Okay, so that still works. Notice it's still a list. The headers, everything still seems to be working okay. And make sure you click around, right? Look at the headers, make sure those are right. I'm going to, so maybe you should, if you want the points. 200, body, okay. And now, if I come in here and I put a /123, what should I get? 404, because there isn't a 1, 2, 3 in these. Okay. Okay, that's good. If I type potatoes, I should still get a 404, right? So you're seeing there's more variation of what a 404 means, and as I will test every single one of them. So if you want all those points, I would test those too. Okay. So restaurants 1, 2, 3 is a 404. Let's put in 2. And that gives me not a list. Do you see any lists? No, that's good. You just want the object, just the dictionary. Okay. So what? It's technically an object here in JSON, but it looks just like a dictionary. 200 status code is okay. Probably should check the headers. That looks okay, right? Cores is saying, yeah, you're good, which Postman doesn't care, but at least that's set. Application JSON looks right. That's why this is nice and pretty formatted. Everybody's on the same page. Okay, the client is getting what it's asking for. And if it's not found, it gets a 404, so the client knows, I don't have restaurant number 80, whatever. I don't have that. Okay. So it's pretty straightforward, but there is a lot of tooling around you need to do in the code. Let's do this. Let's clean up the server. Let's get that nice and tidy, because it's already out of control. Let's talk about what the SQL looks like for delete and update, so that over the next 2 days you can start working on those, at least from Postman's perspective. And then we'll talk about cores, or at least introduce a brief idea, assign that reading, and we'll actually go over it on Wednesday, so that as you work on your client, it won't be broken, right? Because right now, if you were to work ahead a little bit, delete would work great here, not so much in Chrome. Okay, somebody throw out some ideas. Why does my code suck and how can I fix it? This code's great, right? That's kind of what I'm looking for, honestly. A bunch of methods. Make sure yours looks like this. I'll give you points for keeping your code clean on both sides here. But I wouldn't give you full points if I saw this. This looks terrible. The code works, so that's good. But without breaking it, how can I fix it?
Well, you can put all the send response 200s into a method and use that.
Yeah, you could. Notice that all my 200s are a little different, so you can clean it up a lot or a little bit. I think there's a good middle ground. I'll give you one freebie right here. At least this.
At least 404.
I mean, the 404 is literally identical.
Yeah.
Like, come on, right? This, you could try to consolidate this. That'd be cool if you want to do that. Just don't forget that you have to put the body. And so you could do that. What I like to do, this is just me, and I've seen all manner of different things. I don't really care as long as you clean it up, it looks nice and it works, okay? What I like to do is I like to take every response like this one, and maybe this one, and actually this whole thing is kind of just a response, right? If you ignore the 404, that whole thing is kind of get one restaurant, right? Retrieve member restaurant. And this up here is similarly kind of like a whole response, like do all of the work to retrieve the restaurant collection. And then if we keep looking down the page, and you're gonna even have more, like this is a little bit more complicated, but it's doing one particular task. It's creating a restaurant. And you're gonna have one maybe for deleting and updating. So I think if you were to have like 5, maybe 5 or 6, if you include the not found, I think you'd be good. Don't oversimplify, okay? You don't need 28 methods. That would, don't do that. But try to take a stab at this. Let's start with the 404. See, notice that's not even finished. So here's what you're gonna do. You can't get rid of do get, right? That's gotta stay there. And a lot of this path stuff probably needs to stay there, although you could make that a method if you wanted. If you wanted to, that could be. But let's do like the most basic thing. Let's add a method to your class. You can put it above or below. How about I do it above? Doesn't matter. So I'm gonna name this one handle not found. Don't forget self, you're gonna need that. Okay. For most of these methods, the only parameter, most likely, you could add more if you need to. Most likely all you'll need is self, because with self you can do things like send response, send header, and headers. You can do most of the stuff. This is global anyway, so that's okay. Well, I'm sorry, it's not global. It's local. That's what I meant to say. It's local anyway. Okay, so let's try something like this. All the way down here, I've got some 404 code. Looks great. So step 1, I'm going to move it up here, like so. Oops. There. And then once I've got that moved, make sure it looks good. Once I've got that moved, this is probably obvious, but I can come down here and just call my methods. Don't forget self, right? It's a method, not a function. Or more specifically, it's a method. And then here, this code's literally identical, so just take care of business. See how that's nice and tidy now? And then down here, I didn't even do it, so actually probably should just throw that right there. Now I could work on this or this. And like I said, this whole thing, I'm actually going to move into its own method. So I'm going to make some methods. I'm going to make a to-do list here. So dev handle restaurant, and I like to be really verbose. Retrieve member. I'll just pass here. Handle restaurant. Retrieve collection. And then handle restaurant create. Handle restaurant delete member. So if you can make a bunch of these, at least you know what you've got to do, right? Even if they're not all done yet. So I'm just kind of thinking ahead, just not too far, just a little bit. What I absolutely know for sure. I know for sure I've got to get all of the restaurants, one of the restaurants, we did that just barely. Did that a while ago, okay? Deleting and updating, you know it's coming, right? You gotta do it, might as well put a placeholder, even if you don't do it right now, probably. Okay, so that kind of stuff is gonna help you. And notice I'm really specific. The only one I was less specific, I guess you could say create member. Usually you don't create a whole collection, that's not a thing. But the others kind of make sense, okay? All right, so now what? Well, start moving your code around, just be really careful, okay? So in the case of retrieve collection, it's pretty easy. Retrieve collection. Have I broken anything yet? I don't think so. Kind of just does its thing, right? 200, make sure you're not missing anything. I don't think I am. Everything here is kind of self-sustained. Just don't forget to call your method down here. So for example, if I move this code, what's going to happen? Now if I move that down here, any problems?
You have to call the method, that's it.
So I definitely have to call the method. So let me do that, because it's definitely broken. Retrieve member, there we go. Let's take just a minute and notice how nice and clean my code is. It's like, hey, if the resource is restaurants and I don't have an identifier, retrieve the collection of restaurants. If the resource is restaurants and I have an identifier, retrieve a member of the restaurant's collection. Okay, nice and tidy. 404 is down here. Okay. This code is fine. I do have a problem though still. What's my problem? The identifier got lost. Correctly, I was checking the identifier here because I needed to find out if it was none or whatever. But then unfortunately, I was still using it all the way up here. So you could just pass a parameter is what I'd do, right, in this case. I want to be more specific on this one. I'm going to call it what I know it should be in this case, restaurant ID. Restaurant ID, okay. I'm just renaming it because under the context of a restaurant, it should be the restaurant ID. So that all works, and then down here, just pass in your variable. My variable in this case is what? Identifier. Don't get the naming confused. The only reason I'm generic down here is because I haven't established my resource yet. But once I call my method, I'm trying to be more specific as I name it contextually up there, okay? All I'm doing is moving code around, right? You should be able to sling code around like crazy after CS3200, and if you need more practice, here it is. Just be very careful if you're feeling a little uncomfortable moving code into methods and parameters and functions, right? So this isn't something that should kill you, but I suppose you might make a mistake, so just go slow, test one thing at a time. Like I'm not, I just moved everything, right? But probably just test it as you go. I wouldn't move all these at once if you're a little uncomfortable, because then you're not going to have any clue what just broke all of a sudden, right? One thing's broken, and you're going to want to know right away, what did I just barely do to break my code if it breaks? But look at my do-get, it's fantastic. I don't even need this anymore, that's redundant, right? So I go and I figure out my path, and then based on my path, I decide what I'm going to do, and I do it, right? And each individual operation, each REST function, each box in that table becomes its own method, nice and tidy. Just finish this one as well. And I'm here, I might as well do it. Otherwise I never will. Okay, so handle restaurant create, that doesn't require any identifiers, right? It's just doing its thing. So let's see. So I cleaned that up there. So there's a lot that goes on in each one of these, but now as you start writing code and you know there's a problem with updating a restaurant, you'll be able to go to that method, figure out what's wrong. You're not going to be kind of like hyper-focusing, going cross-eyed, trying to figure out where in your code everything's happening. Okay, and you'll do the same thing on your server or on your client, right? You'll have a lot of functions, and those functions will work. On Wednesday and Friday, we're going to be largely talking about the client and talking about JavaScript and context and more with events and loops and how to get all that stuff to work on your client. Now, by Wednesday or Friday, you should be at least half done with your client, 60, 70% done. What we talk about with your client should be the tail end of what you're working on. So if you're feeling a little behind, you probably are. This stuff comes pretty easy, I think, right? And I'm gonna have you go and implement delete and update on your own. Update's kind of scary, I'll be honest with you. So save update on both the client and the server to the very, very last thing you do. Just keep that to like dead last. Not to have you procrastinate, but it will help if you were to do delete first. You'll get a feel for delete, which isn't that bad. And then update, it's just more moving parts with delete. So that's a good thing to end on, not a good thing to start on. Otherwise it might crush your brain before you even get going. Okay. So I think this is done. I haven't tested anything, but I think it's working. I've got my not found, I've got my retrieve member, my retrieve collection. Notice my retrieve member has a not found inside of it. Is that okay? It's calling not found. Totally fine. It has to talk to the database before it knows how to answer. So this is great. You'll do something very similar in all of your member methods. In fact, this general template is what you'll use for delete and update. You're going to have to start, pay very close attention to what I'm saying right now. You're going to have to start your update process by getting the restaurant first. The same thing with delete. Before you delete anything, you're going to have to get it before, just like I am right now. Why would I do that? Why would I retrieve the member with get one restaurant before I delete it? Why would I do that?
So that you know it exists.
Yeah, because if it doesn't exist and you go to delete it, the delete query is just going to be like, cool, done. And you'll be like, well, all right, I guess it's gone. But if it wasn't there to begin with, the end result is the same. It's still gone. And so if you don't get it first, you can't issue your 404 to your client and let them know that it wasn't there. So you're going to go ask the database for the restaurant. If it's not there, you're not going to delete it because it's not there. You're just going to return a 404. Meanwhile, if it is there, you delete it, you move on, 200, end of story. Okay? This is making sense. Okay? So what I said is pretty important. Copy this general template when you do your update and delete. Your update and delete will be inside of this if statement right here, right? If the restaurant exists, delete it. If the restaurant exists, update it. And then respond. Does that make sense? Let's quickly give you the queries for those. Somebody give me the delete query, and then you can write these down and go forth and implement them. I just don't want you to puzzle around the SQL. I just want you to be able to do that. Delete what? No. No. From, yep. From restaurants, in my case. Now if I run this query, what's it gonna do?
Delete.
All restaurants get deleted. Yep, believe it or not, there you go. It does, it's very declarative, right? Delete from restaurants, you got it, done, they're gone. So you probably wanna keep going, and you wanna say where ID equals question mark. Notice it's so similar to select, that's why we did retrieve, so that you could go do delete. It's like the same thing. Don't forget, everybody listening, you're not gonna fetch one, you're not gonna fetch all, there's nothing to fetch. A delete is a delete, not a select. Instead of fetch one or whatever, what are you gonna do? Commit. Why? You change the database. So often I see students who forget that connection.commit and they're like, why isn't it working? Well, you didn't actually push the go button, right? You didn't commit. So don't forget to commit. Everything we're talking about, update, same thing, commit. Let's do update. Okay, how do I do an update?
Would it just be update restaurants?
Yes, I think you're right. Now what?
Where?
It's actually different, it's weird.
Set.
Set. This one's a weird one, I don't know why it's weird, it's just different. Set, and then you're gonna do something like this, you're gonna say name equals question mark, comma, hours, and you're gonna keep going with all of your attributes here, okay? It's different than insert, it looks a lot different, so it's got this equals thing going on. It looks like assigning a variable kind of thing. And then don't forget, what is this gonna do? It's gonna apply these to all restaurants, right? So if you don't want to update all restaurants, what do you need? Where? So this is a unique query. Just stick that on the end. Because insert has one question mark per attribute, yeah? Your select one and your delete have just a single question mark for the ID, and yet this one has all of them. It's got all of your data, so at least 1, 2, in my case I'd have a third one over here, right, whatever, rating. Okay, so I'm gonna have 3. My insert had 3 total, but I've got a 4th one this time because of the ID. So in that array, in that data array, that ID is gonna come last because it'll be last in the query. Make sense? So this one is the most complicated. It's got all the data and the identifier. It's got all the stuff. It's got all the stuff. So by Wednesday, you probably should have some questions, maybe Friday if you're a little behind. You'll have some questions on, okay, wait. How do I make that query work? You might get stuck. Go get stuck. That's what I'm asking you to do. Go get stuck, and then we'll address it. Okay, write those down. You might not get to them until you do what we did today, but now you've got them, right? And I'm not going to go over these, right? I'm not going to do these for you. I'm going to let you go get stuck. Last thing. I think we covered everything. Just want to make sure you got your reading assignment, so don't forget cores on the Mozilla Developer Network. Just Google cores, first link. And please, if you haven't read this for some dumb reason, start at the top, right? Otherwise it's not going to make any sense. Read through simple requests. All of you have done this, yes? And the idea here is to start with pre-flighted requests and read, starting there. It's different, right? It's more complicated. So start reading there, go down. It gives a lot of examples. See, most of this is just code anyway, for HTTP. You don't have to read about redirects. You can skip this. And actually that's the end, because we'll talk about credentials on the next assignment. So you can actually stop a little early. You can stop with redirects. I don't care about that. But everything, it's not actually that much. Everything there, I'd just like you to go through. Whoa, went way past it. Look at the diagrams. You don't have to read all the code step by step. Actually, I don't care about the code. The diagrams and the descriptions are helpful. On Friday, on Wednesday, I better get the impression that you've read this, because I love giving essay assignments. It's like my biggest pet peeve is when I ask you to read the 2 things I ask you to read in the assignment and then you don't. So please do. It'll really help. We'll talk about this on Wednesday, and then we're going to start, we'll write a little bit of code on the server to do this. And then we'll start talking about the JavaScript. So lots of JavaScript. If you have questions with JavaScript, bring those Wednesday. If you have questions with the server, bring those Wednesday. Okay, see you guys.